The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon, subtle and almost ordinary in appearance. The subject line read, "You're invited, a special birthday celebration." It was sent from an address that seemed familiar, though no specific name was attached. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a typical party invitation, bright and cheerful with promises of cake, music, and good company. However, there was something about it that felt off. The words "special" and "celebration" carried an eerie undertone, as if they had been placed there deliberately to mask something more sinister. The sender was a name that couldn't be recalled immediately. Still, the invitation seemed legitimate. After all, it came from someone who claimed to know the recipient well enough to invite them to a private celebration. The details were sparse. "Come join us at 8 p.m. on Saturday at the old farmhouse just outside town. Bring a gift, bring a smile, and be ready for the most unforgettable birthday party you've ever attended." The lack of any other information didn't raise enough suspicion to reject the invite, but it gnawed at the edges of one's thoughts. It was the farmhouse, a place once revered as an old family home, but now largely forgotten by the local community. Rumors had circulated over the years about the house, stories of strange noises, unexplained disappearances, and mysterious lights flickering in its windows at night. Yet, there it was, the location for what was described as a special occasion. At first, the idea of a party there seemed absurd. No one really went out to that area anymore, not after the town had grown and developed around it. The farmhouse, once a symbol of warmth and togetherness, had since fallen into disrepair. The sight of it was enough to raise an eyebrow, but the temptation to attend was too strong to resist. After all, there was a curiosity that burned deep within, a thirst to experience something unique, even if it defied the conventions of normal social gatherings. But then came the second email. It wasn't much, just a simple confirmation, once again from that same mysterious sender. "We're looking forward to seeing you there. Come prepared for the most unforgettable night." The words were the same, yet they seemed to carry an air of urgency, as if they were trying to convince the reader that this was an opportunity not to be missed. The mere suggestion that this event would be unforgettable felt like a challenge, a beckoning to something dark and unknown. As Saturday approached, the uncertainty began to creep in. The farmstead was more than just a place for a birthday party. It was a focal point of local lore, a house that had witnessed decades of strange occurrences. People whispered about it, cautioning others to stay away, but still, the pull of the invitation remained. Perhaps it was simply curiosity, or maybe it was the allure of a party that seemed just a little too intriguing. Either way, the decision was made. The day of the party arrived, and there was a strange sense of expectation in the air. As evening fell, the familiar darkness of the countryside took over, and the farmhouse stood, shadowed and still, on the outskirts of town. The gravel driveway leading to it was long and winding, flanked by overgrown weeds and untended shrubbery. No sign of any other cars was visible, which only added to the eerie isolation of the place. Yet, the invitation had promised that others would be there. And so, the question remained, where were they? The old farmhouse loomed in the distance, its windows dark, as if it was waiting. For what? No one could say. A sense of unease filled the air, a strange anticipation that tugged at the nerves of anyone brave enough to step foot near it. It was then that the doorbell rang, and the invitation that had seemed so innocent moments before now felt like an ominous call, an insistent pull into the unknown. One last glance at the email. "Be ready for the most unforgettable birthday party you've ever attended." The words, once enticing, now sent a chill down the spine. Could it be that something darker than a mere celebration awaited within those walls? With no more time for second thoughts, the door creaked open, and a figure emerged from the shadowy threshold, greeting the guest with a smile that, despite its warmth, seemed unsettlingly hollow. The invitation had been sent, and now the true question loomed larger than ever. What kind of party would unfold behind the closed doors of the old farmhouse? The door swung open wider, revealing the dimly lit interior of the farmhouse. The musty air that escaped from within seemed to carry a weight, as though it had been sealed off from the outside world for far too long. The figure that greeted the guest was neither familiar nor entirely unfamiliar. A man, tall and slim, with a tight-lipped smile that was almost too polished. His eyes were hidden in the shadows, but there was a glint to them that suggested something more than just politeness. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth yet hollow. "You've made it just in time. The others are waiting." Others. The word lingered in the air, mixing with the dust that hung like fog in the dimly lit hallway. The invitation had mentioned a party, but it hadn't given much else away. No specifics about who was hosting, who the other guests were, or what exactly was in store. For a moment, the guest hesitated, unsure whether to step into the darkness of the farmhouse or turn back. The sense of isolation was suffocating, but curiosity, and perhaps a sense of duty to honor the invitation, urged them forward. As the door closed behind them, a strange silence settled over the room. There was no sound of music or laughter, as one might expect at a birthday celebration. Instead, the air felt thick with anticipation, almost as though the house itself was holding its breath. The man, still standing by the door, gestured toward the hallway that led deeper into the house. "Come on in," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. Reluctantly, the guest walked toward the hallway, but as they passed the entryway, their eyes flickered over the walls, dark, worn, and covered in strange, shifting shadows. The house had an unsettling history, yes, but there was something more in the air tonight. Something inexplicable. As they ventured farther inside, the lights dimmed, and the house seemed to stretch, growing more cavernous as it swallowed up any sound from the outside world. The hallway led to a large living room. Despite the darkness, it was impeccably clean, as if the space was only ever used for rare, specific occasions. A large wooden table stood at the center, set with fine silverware and empty glasses. At the far end of the room, a fireplace flickered with an eerie, unnatural glow, though no fire was actually present. Just the warm, inviting illusion of one. It was then that the guest noticed the others, seated around the table, their faces half hidden in shadows. There were 5 of them, all dressed in formal clothing, their eyes staring into space as though they had been waiting for something, perhaps for the guest to arrive. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a brief second, the guest wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But the tall man who had greeted them gave a reassuring smile, as if to say, "Everything's fine. Just join them. Please, take a seat," he said, motioning toward an empty chair at the table. The guest hesitated only for a moment before sitting down. Something about the way the others stared was unsettling, but they couldn't bring themselves to leave. The pull of the place and the gravity of the situation held them in place like an invisible force. As they sat down, the others shifted ever so slightly, their eyes briefly meeting, then turning back to stare into the dimly lit space ahead. They hadn't spoken yet. The room felt suffocatingly still, with the silence stretching on in a way that seemed to magnify every tiny sound, every shuffle of feet, every breath taken. The guest's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Who were these people? Why were they all here? And why was it so quiet? The man who had welcomed the guest finally spoke again. "We've all been invited for the same reason, to celebrate. But more than that, to understand." "Understand what?" the guest asked, their voice barely a whisper. The question seemed absurd, even to themselves. "The reason we're here," he replied, his voice unwavering. "And why none of us can leave until we've figured it out." The words struck the guest like a cold wave, freezing them in place. For a moment, the reality of the situation felt like a bad dream. But there was no waking up from this. They were here, and there was no way out. The silence thickened once more as the others around the table turned their eyes toward the guest, awaiting their reaction. Something about their expressions was both expectant and terrifying, as though they had all been waiting for the moment when someone would finally ask the question. The question that no one wanted to hear, but had to be asked. The question that had brought them all together. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the room grew unbearable. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. And the guest realized, with a sinking feeling in their stomach, that this night was about to take an unexpected and horrifying turn. The invitation had not been about a birthday celebration at all. It was about something far darker, far more twisted. The others were not simply guests. They were players in a game, one that had been set in motion long before anyone had ever stepped foot in this house. And the only thing worse than the unknown? Realizing that you had become a part of it. The weight of the silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. As the guests sat at the table, they couldn't help but glance nervously at the others, whose expressions were unreadable. No one had moved since the man's chilling words, and the tension was so thick it seemed to cling to the very walls of the farmhouse. The crackling of the non-existent fire in the fireplace only added to the eerie atmosphere, its flickering glow casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, like living entities. The guests' mind raced as they tried to piece together the unsettling scenario they had found themselves in. The other attendees seemed almost expectant, waiting for something. But what? The tall man who had greeted them finally spoke again, his voice calm and unervingly steady. "The party can begin now," he said. His words, though seemingly innocuous, carried an undercurrent of something darker, a thinly veiled command. His eyes swept over the gathered guests before resting on the table in front of him, his fingers lightly tapping on the surface. The celebration isn't just about the passing of another year. It's about something more significant. The words hung in the air, and the guests could feel their pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of their neck standing up. It wasn't just a party then. It wasn't just a birthday celebration. But what was it? What could be so important, so significant, that it required this strange gathering in the middle of nowhere? The man's smile widened, as though he could sense the growing unease in the room. He gestured toward the center of the table where a large, ornate cake sat. Its frosting gleamed unnaturally under the low light, and the faintest scent of something sweet, but oddly metallic, wafted through the air. "We begin with the cake," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The cake represents the first step, the first offering. The other guests nodded in solemn agreement, their faces still partially obscured by shadows. Each of them seemed to have a strange, distant calm about them, as though they had been here before and knew exactly what to expect. The guest, however, was gripped by a growing sense of dread. They hadn't signed up for anything like this, and yet, here they were, seated at a table with no way of leaving. The door behind them had closed with an ominous finality, and the thought of trying to escape was immediately dismissed. It would only bring more questions, more unknowns, and the fear of the unknown seemed far worse than the uncertainty of staying put. The tall man reached for the cake and cut a slice, placing it on a fine porcelain plate. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were savoring each moment of the ritual. "It's tradition," he murmured, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. "We must partake of the first piece. After all, this is what brought us all here." He handed the plate to the guest, his smile unchanging. "Would you like the first slice?" he asked, his voice oddly sweet, as if this were the most normal of situations. The guest's stomach twisted with unease, but they couldn't bring themselves to refuse. It felt like an unwritten rule, a part of the game they hadn't yet fully understood. Without another word, the guest took the plate, holding it with trembling hands. The cake was oddly heavy, and the smell grew stronger as they brought it closer to their face. Despite the sweetness of its appearance, there was something off about the scent, a faint, acrid undertone like burnt metal. But there was no turning back now. The others were watching, waiting for them to take a bite. The expectation was palpable, almost suffocating. With a deep breath, the guest cut a small piece and brought it to their lips. As the cake touched their tongue, the taste was not at all what they had imagined. It was bitter, metallic, and unnervingly dense. They could feel it sticking to the roof of their mouth, as though it wasn't quite meant to be eaten. A wave of nausea swept over them, but the eyes of the others, sharp and calculating, remained fixed on them, silent and unblinking. "You're all here for a reason," the tall man said, his voice soft but cutting through the tense silence. "And the reason is simple. This night is not just about fun. It's about what happens when the world around us starts to break down. What happens when we face the truth, The guest put the plate down, but the taste lingered, a sickening reminder of the absurdity of this entire situation. What truth? They thought, their minds scrambling for answers. The room had become suffocating, the shadows stretching across the walls, enveloping them in a tight grip. It was then that they noticed something else. The faces of the other guests, their eyes hollow and lifeless, as if they had been drained of all emotion, all humanity. There was no joy here, no laughter, only the cold, unyielding expectation that this was all part of a plan, part of something much larger and far darker than a simple birthday celebration. The tall man smiled again, this time with a hint of something almost predatory in his gaze. "You see," he said softly, "the game begins the moment you take your first bite. And from here on out, there's no turning back." The guest's heart pounded in their chest. The game. They had heard rumors, whispers about games, about rites and rituals hidden beneath the surface of society, but they had never believed them, never thought they would be a part of something so absurd. Yet here they were, trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The cake, the people, the farmhouse, all of it was part of a carefully orchestrated plan, and they had just taken the first step. The party had officially begun, and now there was no way of knowing what would happen next. What was this game? And more importantly, what role did the guests play in it? There was no escape now, no way out of the darkness that had begun to close in around them. The clock on the wall ticked, its sound unbearably loud in the oppressive silence. The party was just beginning, but it felt as though the end had already arrived. As the guests sat back in their chair, their fingers still trembling from the unnatural bite of the cake, they couldn't help but feel as though they had crossed some invisible threshold. The atmosphere in the room had changed. What had once been an ominous but somewhat manageable gathering now felt like a ritual in full motion, something they could not escape from, no matter how desperately they wanted to. The tall man, who seemed to be orchestrating everything with a calm precision, stood up, his shadow growing long against the dimly lit walls. The others around the table followed suit, rising in unison, as though bound by an unseen force. It was clear now that this wasn't just a birthday party, nor was it a mere celebration. Something far darker was at play. The cake, once seemingly an innocent offering, now seemed like a sacrificial offering, a first step into a ceremony that none of the guests could have foreseen. "Now," the tall man spoke again, his voice cold yet soothing. "We begin the next part of the ritual. You've tasted the cake. That was your first test." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the air. "Now it's time for the rest." The guests, still silent, began to move. They made their way toward a side table that had gone unnoticed until now. The dim light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room as they placed several items on the table, each one more unsettling than the last. There were small vials filled with a dark, viscous liquid, what appeared to be fragments of old, yellowed paper, and a set of candles, black, twisted, and burned down to almost nothing. The atmosphere grew thick with an almost suffocating sense of purpose, and the guests could feel the weight of every passing second, as though each one was leading them closer to some unknown, inevitable conclusion. The tall man turned, his eyes locking onto the guest with an intensity that sent a shiver down their spine. "You're here because you are a participant," he said, his voice lowering, taking on a tone of something almost ceremonial. "Whether you like it or not, you are part of this. You have taken the first step, and now you must continue." The others around the table, those mysterious figures whose faces had remained obscured in the shadows, began to move again, each one picking up an item from the side table and slowly making their way back to the center. They seemed to know exactly what they were doing, each one proceeding with an eerie calmness that suggested familiarity with the proceedings. The guest, on the other hand, felt nothing but confusion, fear, and the growing realization that they were in far too deep. The tall man gestured for them to join the circle. There was no refusal, no option to decline. The atmosphere felt thick with expectation. The guests, reluctantly, found themselves standing and walking toward the table, where a spot had been cleared for them in the center of the strange gathering. It felt as though the room had closed in on them, the walls constricting, the shadows dancing wildly as if they, too, were part of this ritual. "Each of us has a role to play in this ceremony," the man explained, his voice ringing with finality. "And each item before us represents a piece of the puzzle, a key to unlocking the truth of what this night is really about." The first item in the center of the table was a vial filled with the dark liquid. The guest noticed that each of the other participants had their own vial, though the contents of theirs appeared different. Some were clear, some had an odd, iridescent sheen, while others were thick with strange particles. The tall man handed the vial to the guest, his expression unreadable. "Drink," he commanded softly. "This is your next step." The guest recoiled slightly, a surge of instinctual fear welling up inside them. This was too much, too fast. They could already feel the sickening bite of the cake deep in their stomach, twisting and churning, making everything around them feel surreal, as though they were floating in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. "But why?" the guest managed to ask, their voice trembling. The man smiled, his lips curling just enough to reveal a hint of malice. "Because it's the only way to move forward. The ritual must be completed in its entirety. No one can leave until it's finished. This is how it works." The room grew silent again, the weight of his words pressing in on them all. The guest looked around the table at the other participants. They had all already consumed their vials, their faces eerily calm, as if they had all done this before and knew exactly what to expect. There was no trace of hesitation in their eyes. Slowly, with trembling hands, the guest lifted the vial to their lips. The liquid inside was thick and sluggish, as though it were resisting the movement. The moment it touched their tongue, a coldness spread through their entire body, a shock that sent their heart racing. The taste was bitter, metallic again, but this time, there was something else, something that lingered on their tongue, burning their throat as it slid down. The effects were almost instantaneous. The room seemed to sway, the walls warping as though they were breathing, and for a moment, the guest felt as though they might faint. But they couldn't. They had to stay present. They had to understand. Before the dizziness could take full effect, the tall man raised his hand, signaling the end of the ritual's first part. The guests could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on them, but they couldn't process it entirely. Their mind was spinning, caught between confusion and terror, unable to fully grasp what was happening. All they knew was that they were part of something much larger, something much older and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The others stood in perfect synchrony, their faces still hidden in shadow, their hands pressed against the table as though in quiet reverence. It was as if they were no longer individuals, but part of a greater whole, bound together by the ritual they had just initiated. The tall man took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the guest. "Now," he said, his voice carrying a new edge of authority, "we wait. The ceremony is far from over, and what comes next is something only those who are truly ready can understand." The guest, reeling from the effects of the liquid, could feel the house itself tightening around them, like the grip of a great, unseen hand. The night had just begun, and there was no turning back. The truth, whatever it might be, was still waiting to be revealed. The room, already thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, now felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The guest, still reeling from the effects of the strange liquid they had consumed, struggled to regain some sense of composure. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement exaggerated. The soft flicker of candlelight cast long, distorted shadows across the room, creating the illusion that the very air was alive with ominous intent. The tall man stood at the head of the table, his face expressionless, yet his eyes held an almost predatory gleam. There was something about him, something that felt entirely inhuman. His stillness, the way he commanded the room with nothing but his presence, was unnatural. The guests around the table, too, seemed to move with a deliberate slowness, their actions synchronized as though they were puppets on invisible strings. The guest, now more alert than ever, couldn't help but feel the weight of an invisible force pushing down on them, urging them to participate, to comply. There was a shift in the atmosphere. The air grew colder, and the candles flickered as though responding to an unseen presence. The guest felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to glance at the doorway. It was there, at the edge of their vision, that they saw it, a shadow, long and twisted, moving with a purpose. But when they blinked, it was gone, leaving them to question their own perception. The strange events of the night had already begun to distort their sense of reality, and they were unsure of what was real and what was merely a product of their growing paranoia. The tall man finally spoke, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "It has begun," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "The moment you took the first step, you sealed your fate. There is no going back now." The guest's heart raced as the truth of his words settled into their bones. It was as if a contract had been signed, an unspoken agreement that they had unknowingly entered into. But what did it mean? What had they agreed to? The burning question gnawed at them, yet there was no time for answers. The tall man raised his hand, and the guests around the table fell into a perfect stillness, their eyes locked onto him as though waiting for the next instruction. "You will now play your part," the tall man continued, his voice unwavering. "Each of you has been chosen. You are here for a reason. This is not a mere coincidence. This is destiny. Destiny." The word hung in the air like a dark promise, a foreboding that sank into the guest's chest. They wanted to ask questions, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in their throat. The strange liquid they had ingested seemed to have taken hold of their senses, leaving them disoriented and detached from their own body. The room spun slightly and their vision blurred. For a moment, they thought they might collapse, but they held themselves upright, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of control. The tall man moved toward the table and picked up the first object, the fragment of old, yellowed paper. He held it high, as though it were a sacred relic. "This is the first key," he announced, his voice reverberating with power. "The written word, the language that binds us all." He extended the paper toward the guest, and for the first time that night, they were forced to make a choice. The guest hesitated. What was this piece of paper? What did it represent? The air was thick with expectation, and they knew that whatever they did next would carry consequences. They reached out tentatively, their fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The moment their skin made contact, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned as if they were alive, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo hit the guest. They stumbled back, their breath quickening, as a wave of memories flooded their mind, memories that were not their own. Visions flashed before their eyes, fragmented, distorted images of people they didn't recognize, places they had never seen. There were whispers, faint but insistent, in a language that felt ancient, almost forgotten. The guest tried to push the images away, but they were relentless, pressing in on them from all sides. The sensation was overwhelming, like they were being pulled into another world entirely, one that existed just beyond the veil of their consciousness. The tall man stood still, watching with a strange intensity. His expression had not changed, but there was something in the way he held himself, something that hinted at the power he wielded, something that suggested he was not entirely human. The others around the table, too, seemed to be experiencing something similar, their faces blank yet focused, their bodies rigid as though they were in some kind of trance. The guest tried to speak, but no words came out. They opened their mouth, but their voice was swallowed by the overwhelming noise in their head. The whispers grew louder, their meaning becoming clearer. They were speaking of a pact, of promises made long ago, and the price that had to be paid. The guest understood, in a fleeting, fragmented way, that they were part of something far greater, something ancient, something that spanned centuries. "Do you understand?" The tall man's voice cut through the haze in their mind. It was not a question of curiosity, but one of demand. "This is what you've chosen. This is your path. You cannot escape it." The guest nodded weakly, their body trembling as they slowly released the piece of paper. The moment it left their hand, the images ceased, and the room returned to its unsettling stillness. But the sense of dread had only intensified. It was as though the fabric of reality had been torn open, exposing something dark and primal lurking beneath. The tall man placed the paper back on the table and turned to the other participants. "The next step awaits," he said, his voice low, and almost reverent. The first key has been unlocked. The rest will follow. As the other guests began to move, the guest remained frozen, their minds still reeling from what they had just experienced. The truth was slowly beginning to unfurl, but it was a truth they were not ready to face. Something dark and ancient was awakening, and they were at the center of it, whether they liked it or not. There was no turning back now. The unease in the room grew palpable after the guests' interaction with the first key. The dim light from the flickering candles cast erratic shadows on the walls, now more menacing than ever. The oppressive silence that followed felt suffocating, as if the very air in the room was thick with secrets waiting to be revealed. The tall man, still at the head of the table, remained silent, his gaze unwavering as he observed the guests, each one seemingly lost in their own private worlds, processing the strange and unsettling experiences they had just undergone. The atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just a birthday party gone wrong. It had become something far more sinister. The guest felt it deeply, as though they were standing on the precipice of something enormous, something that had been set into motion long before their arrival. The room itself seemed to pulsate with an unseen energy, a quiet hum that vibrated beneath the floorboards, subtly shifting the fabric of reality. Every moment felt as though the room might explode in chaos, yet it remained eerily still, as though the calm before the storm was all that existed. A soft clink of glass echoed in the room, breaking the silence. One of the guests, who had been seated across from the tall man, slowly raised a glass to their lips and took a sip. The liquid inside shimmered faintly in the candlelight, but it was unclear if it was simply the reflection of the flames or something more, something that seemed to distort the very nature of the drink. The guest observed this with a sense of foreboding. The ritualistic movements of the others, the slow, deliberate way they interacted with their surroundings, made everything seem unreal. It was as if they were all actors playing parts in a twisted, unscripted play, waiting for the next cue to act. The tall man's eyes never left the guest, his stare sharp and calculating. It was unsettling, as though he could see straight through them, piercing their thoughts, their fears, their deepest secrets. The weight of his gaze was unbearable, and the guest fought the impulse to look away. There was something magnetic about him, something that compelled the guest to stay focused, even as every instinct screamed at them to flee. But where could they go? The walls seemed to close in on them with every passing moment, and the door, the only exit, was now just an illusion, a barrier that no one dared approach. The air grew even colder, and the guests could feel a shiver crawl up their spine. The others remained still, frozen in time, their eyes locked on the tall man. The sensation of being trapped intensified, and the guest's mind raced, struggling to make sense of the madness surrounding them. They had come here expecting a simple gathering, a birthday party, not this. Not whatever this was. But there were no answers to be found in the room. Only more questions, more mysteries that demanded to be unraveled. The tall man finally broke the silence. His voice, smooth and controlled, resonated in the stillness. "The second key will soon be revealed," he said, his words calculated and measured. "The game has only just begun." He then turned his gaze to the other guests, his eyes glinting with something that could only be described as amusement. "Are you ready to continue?" The guest's stomach twisted. The game? What game? Was that what this was? A game? Or was it something far darker? The words lingered in the air, unsettling and cryptic. As the tall man spoke, the other guests seemed to stir for the first time in what felt like hours. Their expressions remained blank, their faces void of emotion, but the sense of anticipation in the room was undeniable. It was as if they had all been waiting for this moment. And now, with the tall man's words, the next chapter of this bizarre gathering had begun. A low murmur rose from the table as the guests began to exchange glances. There was an unspoken understanding between them, an acknowledgement of the gravity of what was unfolding. The guest was certain that none of them were unaware of the true nature of the evening. This was no ordinary birthday party, no celebration of life. This was something far more sinister, a gathering of those who had been chosen to partake in a ritual that stretched far beyond the boundaries of mortal comprehension. The tall man stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He walked to the far side of the room, his movements deliberate and measured. As he reached a small wooden cabinet, he turned back to the guests. "The second key," he said again, more firmly this time, "is not something you can see with your eyes alone. It must be felt. It is the thing you fear most." The room fell into an uneasy silence once more. The tall man's words hung heavy in the air, their meaning obscure and unsettling. Fear, the guest realized, was the second key, the fear that resided in the deepest, most hidden corners of their mind. It was the thing that controlled them, the force that kept them trapped in this twisted game. And now, it seemed, they were being asked to face it head-on. The tall man returned to the table, a small, ornate box in his hands. The box was simple in design, yet there was something about it that seemed to pulse with a quiet, malevolent energy. He placed it in the center of the table and slowly opened the lid. The contents were hidden from view, obscured by a dark, velvety cloth. The air grew heavier, charged with a sense of expectation as the guests leaned forward, eager to see what lay within. "Your fear," the tall man said, his voice almost a whisper, "is waiting for you." The guest's heart raced. The second key had been revealed, but what would it cost them to unlock it? What was hidden inside that box? And more importantly, what would they have to face when the fear they had long buried was brought to the surface? The room seemed to close in around them as the answers, so close yet out of reach, seemed to slip further away with each passing moment. The storm was coming, and there would be no escaping it. The guests stared at the box in the center of the table, a heavy feeling of dread washing over them. What had the tall man meant when he said the second key was fear? And how was that connected to what lay beneath the velvet cloth in the box? The room had become a strange, oppressive space, thick with the weight of unspoken fears, the walls seemingly pressing in on them from all sides. It felt as though each guest in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold, yet no one dared to speak. The tall man had made it clear the time for questions was over. Now, they had to face whatever came next. The other guests remained eerily silent. None of them moved, none of them reacted. Their blank expressions betrayed no hint of emotion. To an outsider, they might have seemed like statues frozen in time. But the guest felt a disquieting undercurrent, an energy rippling beneath the surface, something barely perceptible but undeniably present. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was pregnant with tension, with an anticipation that thrummed in the air like an invisible current. The tall man, his presence a constant force in the room, glanced around at the guests, his gaze lingering on each of them. There was something in his eyes, an unsettling calmness, a knowing that made the guest's skin crawl. It was as if he was in complete control, as if he had orchestrated every movement, every interaction that had occurred in the room up to this point. The guests could not shake the feeling that they were pawns in a much larger, far more dangerous game. And then, without a word, the tall man slowly reached into the box. He lifted the velvet cloth, revealing its contents, an ornate, intricately carved key, unlike any the guest had ever seen. The metal shimmered in the candlelight, a strange, otherworldly glow emanating from it as though it were alive. The key was beautiful, almost hypnotically so, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It didn't belong here, in this world. It was as though it had come from a place far beyond their understanding. The tall man held the key up, letting the light catch its edges. "This," he said, his voice a low murmur that reverberated in the stillness, "is the second key. It is your fear, but it is also your truth." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The guests could feel the weight of those words pressing on them, suffocating them in a way that was impossible to explain. What was the truth? And why was it bound to their fear? For the first time since the evening began, the guests felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to run from this room, from this place, and never look back. The walls seemed to constrict even further, as though the very building itself were closing in on them, trapping them in an inescapable nightmare. But the fear of leaving was just as strong as the fear of staying. The guest realized that no matter what they did, no matter where they went, they were already caught in this web, entangled in something far larger than themselves. The tall man placed the key gently on the table, his fingers lingering for a moment as if he were savoring the moment. "You have all been brought here for a reason," he continued. "The second key reveals not just what you fear, but what you have hidden from yourself. The fear that you carry with you, buried deep within your soul, is a reflection of your truth. The question is, are you willing to confront it?" The room seemed to hold its breath. The guests stared at the key, their faces unreadable. Yet there was a shift in the air, an undeniable tension that rippled outward, infecting everything in the room. The key, despite its beauty, was a harbinger of something darker. It represented the unknown, the parts of themselves they had tried to forget or bury. It was not just an object, it was a symbol of everything they had hidden away, of everything they feared to confront. The guest's mind raced. What had they hidden from themselves? What was their own truth? And what did it have to do with the key? They had been so focused on surviving the night, on navigating the strange and terrifying circumstances that surrounded them, that they hadn't stopped to consider the possibility that this was about more than just a twisted party. This was about their own darkest truths, the very things they had buried beneath layers of time and circumstance, the things they were most afraid to face. The tall man's voice cut through the guest's spiraling thoughts. "The key is not just a tool. It is a mirror." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "It reflects your soul, your deepest desires, your darkest fears, and it is now yours to wield. But be warned, once you hold it, you cannot undo what it reveals." The guest's stomach twisted. A mirror? How could a key be a mirror? But as they looked at the shimmering object on the table, something within them shifted. The key was not just a physical object, it was a psychological one. It was a doorway to something else, to memories, to emotions, to truths that they had never fully understood, or perhaps never wanted to understand. The tall man gestured toward the other guests. "Each of you must now choose," he said, his tone almost amused. "Will you take the key and confront your truth? Or will you walk away from it, forever bound by the fear you refuse to face?" The guests' heart pounded in their chest as they looked around the table. Each person seemed lost in their own thoughts, their faces unreadable, as if they were grappling with their own demons. But none of them seemed to speak. None of them moved. It was as if the room had frozen in time, waiting for someone to make the first move. Finally, the guest's hand trembled as it hovered over the key. The choice was clear: confront the fear or be consumed by it. But in that moment, they understood something far deeper. This wasn't just about facing the fear. It was about accepting the truth of who they were, what they had become, and the consequences of everything they had chosen to ignore. As the guest's hand hovered over the key, the room seemed to hold its breath. Time appeared to stretch infinitely, each second lingering like a bead of sweat on the forehead. The silence was suffocating. They could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on them. No one spoke, and the air felt thick, as if the room itself was watching, waiting for the guest to make the inevitable choice. In that moment, they realized how much fear had shaped their life. It was like a constant, invisible presence that dictated every step they took, every decision they made. They had spent so much time running from the truths they couldn't bear to face, from the people they hurt, the mistakes they made, and the things they tried to forget. But the key before them wasn't just a symbol of their past. It was a challenge to stop hiding, to stop pretending, and to face the fear that had been the silent ruler of their life. The guest's mind raced, filled with images of the past. Each failure, each regret, each moment of fear and self-doubt. There were relationships that had been ruined, opportunities lost, and dreams that had withered under the weight of their own insecurities. But now, standing here in the presence of this strange man and his twisted game, it became clear that they could no longer ignore the truth of what they had become, of what they had allowed themselves to become. The guest was trapped in a cycle of avoidance, of fear, and now they had to confront it. They slowly reached out, their fingers brushing against the cold metal of the key. The moment their skin touched it, a shiver ran down their spine. It was as though the key had come to life, responding to their touch, acknowledging their fear. They could feel it pulsing beneath their fingers, the pulse of something ancient, something forgotten. They hesitated for only a moment before their hand fully wrapped around the key. The decision had been made. The tall man, still standing at the head of the table, nodded in approval. His eyes glinted with an expression that was impossible to decipher. The guest felt his gaze burn through them, as though he could see straight into their soul, past all the walls and masks they had constructed over the years. "Good," he said softly, almost imperceptibly. "Now you must unlock it." Unlock it? The guest was confused. They had thought that taking the key was the end of the process, the culmination of the challenge. But now it seemed there was more. A puzzle within a puzzle. The key was not just a tool for revelation. It was a key to something deeper, something more sinister. The tall man had hinted at it earlier. The key was a mirror, a reflection of their soul. But now the guest began to wonder, was it also a trap? The guest's eyes flicked to the other guests at the table, but no one moved. They all sat in eerie silence, as though they too were waiting for the next step to unfold. Their faces were unreadable, emotionless. It was as if they had already accepted their fate, as though they were resigned to the consequences of whatever had brought them here. The guests' thoughts raced. Was this their chance to break free? To confront the fear and take control of their destiny? Or was it the beginning of something far worse? They could feel a gnawing sense of unease growing within them, the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a precipice with no way to turn back. They looked down at the key in their hand, and in that moment, the weight of its significance became crushingly clear. It was no longer just an object. It was the physical manifestation of their choices, the choices that had shaped their life, their past, and now their future. It was a symbol of everything they had avoided, of everything they had buried. And now they had to face it. With trembling hands, the guest turned the key in the air, as though preparing to unlock the truth. But as they did, a chilling sound echoed through the room. It wasn't a click or a turn, but something deeper, a resonance, a vibration in the air that made the guest's skin crawl. They looked around, expecting to see some shift in the environment. But nothing changed. The room remained the same, silent and oppressive. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered. A shadow moved across the walls, stretching long and thin before vanishing into the dark corners of the room. The guests froze, their heart pounding in their chest. Was this part of the game? Or had something else been awakened by the key? The room felt different now, more alive, more dangerous. The tall man's voice broke the silence, his words like ice cutting through the tension. "You have unlocked something, but not what you expected." His smile was thin, calculating. "Now, you must face what you've awakened." The key has not only unlocked the door to your past, it has opened a door to something far darker. A door that will not be easily closed again. The guests swallowed hard, their throat dry. They could feel the room closing in on them, the walls pressing against their skin, suffocating them with a sense of impending doom. The key was no longer just a symbol. It was a catalyst, a trigger that had set something in motion. But what? What had they unleashed? The other guests remained still, their expressions unchanged, but the guests could sense a shift in the atmosphere. They were no longer alone in the room. Something else was there, something unseen but palpably present. The fear that had gripped them earlier now felt like a distant memory. This was something different, something worse. The fear had transformed into something far more tangible, and now they had to confront it head-on. As the guests stood frozen, clutching the key, the unsettling silence in the room deepened. The shadows in the corners of the space seemed to stretch and move, as though alive, watching, waiting. The atmosphere had thickened, heavy with the scent of something ancient and forgotten, something that had been buried for too long. The tall man's cryptic words echoed in the guest's mind. "You have unlocked something, but not what you expected." What had they unlocked? What had they done? The guests turned their gaze back to the key, now feeling its weight not only in their hand, but in their very soul. The feeling of inevitability settled over them. Whatever had been set in motion could not be undone. It wasn't just the door to their past they had opened. It was a door to something much darker, something that had been buried in the recesses of their own memory. It was like a chain of events that had been set into motion long before they had ever arrived at the party, a series of actions that now converged on this moment. What had they hidden all these years? The question tore at the fabric of their thoughts, like a persistent whisper that wouldn't let them rest. They thought of all the things they had buried, the guilt, the shame, the terrible mistakes that had defined their life. Was this key the manifestation of those mistakes? Had they somehow created the darkness they now faced? It seemed impossible, yet in this eerie, surreal reality, it felt undeniable. The tall man's gaze never left them, his silent observation almost as if he could sense the turmoil inside their mind. The other guests at the table were still. Not one of them spoke, their faces frozen in expressions of passive indifference. It was as though they were actors in a play, each playing their part in a scenario that had long been scripted, waiting for the guest to make the next move. But there was no script here. The game had become real, and with that, the stakes had never been higher. The guest felt a strange sensation, as though the room was beginning to change. The walls, once solid and familiar, now felt like they were shifting. The images of the past, long forgotten, seemed to flood back into their consciousness. Memories, fragmented and jagged, pierced through the fog of their mind like shards of broken glass. Faces long gone, moments they had never truly faced. Every wrong turn, every decision that had led them here, now replaying in vivid detail. But what terrified them most was not the memories themselves, but the fact that they could hear them. Not in the normal way, but as if the voices were coming from inside their head. The words, the laughter, the cries, they all echoed, blending together in a cacophony of sound. Their own voice joined in, the one they had spent so many years trying to silence, now breaking through the barrier they had built. You knew. You always knew. It whispered. You couldn't hide from it forever. The room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of those echoes, and the guests could feel their sense of reality slipping. The boundaries between what was real and what was imagined had blurred. The party, the guests, the tall man, they no longer seemed like physical entities. They had become symbols, reflections of something far more sinister. The key, still clenched in their hand, had become the focal point of everything. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was the thing that had unlocked the floodgates of their mind, revealing everything they had buried. The tall man's voice cut through the chaotic noise, calm and unnerving. You were warned. The past is not something that can simply be ignored, not when it has such power. His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with truth. You've walked this path before, and now you must confront what you have forgotten. There is no escaping it. The echoes will never stop. The guest's breath caught in their throat. Forgotten? What had they forgotten? What did the tall man mean? Their thoughts were spinning now, spiraling out of control. The more they tried to focus, the more they felt themselves losing grip on reality. The echoes were too loud, too overwhelming. Faces from the past, people they had wronged, people they had failed, they all loomed around them. Ghostly figures in the dark, their eyes accusing. In the midst of this madness, the guest realized with chilling clarity that they had been running from themselves all along. The darkness they had unlocked was not some external force, but the darkness within their own soul. The things they had done, the choices they had made, had followed them, whispered to them, and now they were being forced to face them head-on. A sudden surge of anger flooded their chest. How could they have been so blind? How could they have let this happen? But there was no time for self-pity, no room for denial. The tall man had been right. There was no escaping it. They had unlocked something that could never be undone, something that had always been there, festering beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to surface. The guest's hand tightened around the key, the cold metal pressing into their palm. The choice was no longer theirs to make. The echoes, the memories, the darkness, it was all part of them now. There was no running, no hiding. It was time to face the consequences of the past, to confront the shadows that had been waiting for this moment. Whatever lay beyond the door, beyond the key, it was their responsibility now. The past had come to claim its due, and the guest was finally ready to pay the price. In the wake of the previous chapter's revelation, a sense of foreboding settled heavily over the guest. It was not a question of if they would face the consequences of their actions, but when the past they had so carefully buried had returned with a vengeance. It felt as if the key in their hand was not just a physical object, but a portal, one that connected them directly to the ghosts of their own mistakes. The room around them seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with the weight of their inevitable confrontation. There was no escape now. The door had been opened, and the shadows had come to claim their due. The tall man, standing ominously at the head of the table, remained silent. His presence, once enigmatic and authoritative, now seemed almost passive in comparison to the storm that raged inside the guest. They had entered this strange gathering thinking they could outsmart fate, hoping to avoid the reckoning that was long overdue. But there was no trickery here, no clever maneuver to escape their past. The tall man had not led them into this maze of memories and consequences. They had walked willingly into it, chasing their own fear, their own guilt. It was not only the key that had opened this door, it was their own decision to face what had been avoided for so long. They had not merely unlocked a door, they had chosen to walk through it. And now they stood in a realm where time, space, and reality no longer held the same meaning. It felt as though they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, where every turn was a reflection of their worst fears. The room around them began to distort. The figures at the table, still silent, still motionless, seemed to blur and fade, becoming shadows of their former selves. The guest blinked, trying to regain focus, but the world around them was shifting, slipping between dimensions. There were flashes of images, disconnected and jarring, each one a scene from their past. A face they had loved, a voice they had ignored, a smile they had taken for granted. Each image was a reminder, an accusation. The past had not remained dormant. It had been waiting for this very moment to rise. The guests could feel the pressure of the past weighing on them, a physical presence pressing in from all sides. It was as if they were drowning in their own guilt, each breath more labored than the last. They had always believed that ignoring the past would make it fade, that running from their mistakes would somehow erase them. But now, standing on the precipice of their own soul, they realized how wrong they had been. The past could not be erased. It could not be outrun. It could only be confronted. A voice broke through the swirling chaos, deep and unsettling, though its source was impossible to place. You think you can outrun what you've done? You think hiding will protect you? The words echoed in the guest's mind, filling every corner of their being. They could feel their chest tighten, their breath becoming shallow. The voice was not just in their head, it was inside them, as though it had always been a part of them. This was no stranger's voice. It was the voice of their own conscience, the voice they had ignored for too long. The guests stumbled back, their eyes scanning the room for some semblance of reality. But there was no escape from this place, this twisting nightmare that had been conjured by their own fears. You want to face your mistakes, do you? The voice continued, now laced with venom. Then do it. Show me what you're really made of. Show me that you can look at yourself and live with what you've done. The challenge was clear, and for a fleeting moment, the guest felt a surge of defiance. Yes, they had made mistakes. Yes, they had hurt people, but hadn't they changed? Hadn't they tried to make things right? To move forward? The past was gone, wasn't it? They had to believe it could be left behind. But as soon as the thought crossed their mind, a new wave of guilt crashed over them. The guest felt their resolve crumble, the foundation of their defense shattered. They had tried to bury it all, to forget, but here in this room, surrounded by their own choices and failures, they realized that nothing had truly been resolved. The people they had wronged, the bridges they had burned, they all still existed, lingering in the background of their mind, waiting to be acknowledged. And now, the time had come. The tall man finally spoke again, his voice calm, but filled with an unsettling clarity. You can no longer hide. The cost of confrontation is steep, and you must be willing to pay it. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of an undeniable truth. There was no escaping the reckoning. The past had come to claim its due, and the guest had no choice but to face it. It was then that the guest realized the true price of this confrontation. It was not a matter of simply acknowledging their mistakes or making amends. No, the cost was far greater than that. To confront the past, to truly face the consequences of their actions, they would have to give up something precious. The guest could feel it now, the pull of the darkness, the heaviness in their chest. They would have to give up their self-deception, their pride, and perhaps even the very illusion of who they thought they were. The door they had opened was not just a door to their past. It was a doorway to their own transformation, and transformation always demanded a price. The key, still tightly clenched in their hand, had become both a symbol and a burden. It was the tool of their own destruction, but also the key to their salvation. What lay beyond that door, beyond this moment of reckoning, was unknown, but there was no turning back. The guest had walked this path, and now they must finish what they had started, no matter the cost. It was time to face the darkness, to confront the price of their actions, and to finally see if redemption was even possible. The realization of the price to be paid for confronting the past was overwhelming. As the guests stood there, the weight of their own guilt pressing heavily on their chest, they couldn't help but wonder if this was truly what they had expected. All their life, they had been taught that facing one's mistakes was the path to redemption, that through penance and remorse, they would somehow find peace. But now, standing in this distorted reality, they questioned everything they had once believed about forgiveness and change. Could one ever truly atone for the choices they had made? Was there any way back from the consequences of their actions? The room around them seemed to pulse with the weight of the question. It had become more than just a physical space. It was a reflection of their psyche, an embodiment of their fragmented sense of self. The tall man, whose presence had once felt so distant and powerful, now stood merely as an observer in the background, watching their struggle unfold. His silence was deafening. It was as if he had no need to speak. Everything the guest needed to know was already there, hanging heavily in the air. The moment had arrived. The confrontation was inevitable, but the guest didn't feel ready. In fact, they felt more lost than ever. For the first time, they began to truly consider the possibility that they had been avoiding something far deeper than just their mistakes. The past was no longer a series of events they could simply rewrite or discard. It was a living entity, something that had taken root within them, feeding off their shame, their regret, and their fear. The guest had spent so much of their life trying to escape it, but here in this strange room, with its shifting walls and lingering shadows, they realized the truth. There was no escape. There was only confrontation. There was only acknowledgement. In this distorted place, every memory, every forgotten regret came rushing back. Faces, voices, and places long buried in the recesses of their mind reappeared with startling clarity. Some were kind, offering forgiveness. Others, more painful and accusing, were a reminder of the damage they had caused. The guests saw the faces of people they had hurt, the ones they had abandoned, the ones they had betrayed. Each one was now an apparition in this twisted world, waiting for them to face the consequences of their actions. The sound of their breath became deafening in the silence of the room. Each inhale felt labored, as though the air itself was thick with the weight of their regrets. Their hands trembled slightly as they clenched the key tighter, the cold metal now a reminder of the irrevocable decision they had made. They had chosen this path, and now it seemed they had no choice but to continue down it, no matter where it led. There was no turning back. The door had already been opened, and the shadows were stirring. The tall man finally moved. His figure blurred for a moment before becoming sharp again, standing directly in front of the guest. He seemed to materialize out of nowhere, his presence as imposing as ever. He looked at the guest with an unreadable expression, his eyes dark but not unkind. "You've seen what lies ahead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what of what lies within you? Do you think this is all there is? That redemption can be found in facing the past alone?" The question echoed in the guest's mind. reverberating through every fiber of their being. What lay within them? They had spent so much time chasing external validation, trying to make amends for their actions. But had they truly come to terms with the depths of their own darkness? Could they accept not only the mistakes they had made, but the flawed parts of themselves they had always hidden, even from their own heart? There was a pause, and the guests' eyes dropped to the key in their hand. They had been holding it tightly for so long, thinking it was the answer, thinking it was the means to unlock their salvation. But now, they wondered, was the key a symbol of their redemption, or was it a tool to open the door to their ultimate destruction? It felt like both, and yet neither. It was as if the key itself held the power to unravel them completely, to expose every hidden fear, every buried truth, and every unacknowledged failure. As they stood there, caught in the turmoil of their own thoughts, the room began to shift once again. The walls, once fixed and solid, began to dissolve into mist, swirling around them like the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. The shadows that had been lurking in the corners of the room now seemed to grow, stretching toward the guest, their cold tendrils reaching out to claim them. It was as though the very space around them was alive, feeding on their uncertainty, their hesitation. The tall man's voice broke through the encroaching darkness. You're at the precipice now. What will you choose? Will you face yourself, truly and completely? Or will you turn away, as you have so many times before? The question was not rhetorical. It demanded an answer. The guests could feel the weight of it pressing down on them. For the first time in their life, they understood that this confrontation was not just about facing the mistakes they had made. It was about confronting the truth of who they were, without the filters of pride, guilt, or shame. They had been hiding from themselves for so long, and now the time had come to face the most difficult truth of all, their own humanity. The darkness around them seemed to grow ever more oppressive as they hesitated. The tall man's presence loomed larger, but now, instead of feeling intimidated, the guest felt something shift within them. They were no longer a victim of this space, of these events. They had power here, a power they had never fully understood until now. They held the key, not to their redemption, but to their ability to break free from the cycles that had bound them for so long. And as the mist swirled around them, the guest made a decision. They would not run. They would not hide. The past would no longer have power over them. With trembling hands, they held the key before them and stepped forward, not knowing what awaited beyond the mist, but knowing with certainty that they would face whatever came next. As the guests stepped forward, key in hand, the swirling mist seemed to part, revealing a space that felt both familiar and alien. It was a room, but not one that could have existed in any conventional sense. The walls were not solid, but made of an almost translucent material that shimmered with an iridescent glow. It was as if the room itself was breathing, shifting with each passing second. There was no door, no clear exit, only the guest, the tall man, and the room that seemed to expand and contract like the very essence of the world itself. The air was heavy with an unspoken promise, one that seemed to press in on the guest from all sides. They could feel their heartbeat quicken, a mixture of anticipation and dread coursing through their veins. The key in their hand felt colder now, the weight of it somehow more significant, as if it had become a conduit for the very forces that governed this strange place. What had they unlocked? What truth awaited them on the other side of this surreal moment? The tall man stood in the center of the room, his posture still as commanding as before. He had not moved, but there was something different about him now. His eyes, once dark and inscrutable, now shimmered with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the guest's very soul. He was not merely an observer anymore. He was a part of this strange, shifting reality, and his presence seemed to resonate with a profound significance. "You've come far," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something more, a sense of inevitability. "But do you understand the cost of what you are about to face?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The guest felt the weight of it, but they could not yet grasp what it truly meant. They had been following a path, chasing an elusive idea of redemption, but now, as they stood in this ethereal space, They began to sense that redemption, as they had once imagined it, was a far more complicated thing than they had ever realized. Do you think you can simply unlock the door to your past, to the mistakes you've made, and walk away unscathed? The tall man continued, his tone now edged with a warning. Truth is not a gift, it is a price. And some truths are not meant to be uncovered. The guest hesitated. The very foundation of their understanding had been shaken. For so long, they had believed that facing their past, no matter the consequences, was the key to moving forward. But now, the tall man's words felt like a bitter truth they had not been prepared for. Was there such a thing as too much truth? Was it possible that confronting the past could be more damaging than simply leaving it buried? The room seemed to pulse with this unsettling idea, the walls warping as if to reflect the growing tension within the guest's mind. The shadows that had once seemed like distant figures now seemed closer, creeping toward them with a chilling purpose. The key in their hand felt heavy once again, its cold metal a reminder of the path they had chosen. You can walk away, the tall man said, his voice now softer, almost coaxing. Leave the past where it belongs. Turn the key and return to your life. You can continue living in ignorance, in the safety of the lies you've told yourself. But if you choose to go further, there is no turning back. There are truths that will break you. Are you willing to pay that price? The guests stood frozen, the weight of the decision pressing down on them with increasing intensity. The tall man's words echoed in their mind, reverberating through their thoughts like a haunting refrain. Was the past truly worth facing? Was the knowledge that awaited them worth the pain and upheaval that would surely follow? They had come this far, but now, as they stood at the precipice of something far darker than they had anticipated, they wondered if they had made a grave mistake. For a moment, the guest thought of turning back. They could feel the pull of the world they had known, the life they had left behind. It was safe, predictable, even comforting. But deep down, they knew that they had already stepped beyond the point of no return. The choice had been made long ago. This was merely the consequence of their own desires, their yearning to understand, to know. The truth, no matter how painful, was something they could not escape. With trembling hands, they stepped forward once more, the keys still gripped tightly in their palm. The tall man's gaze never wavered, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, as if he had expected this response. The room seemed to contract around them, the walls now closing in with a quiet, suffocating force. It was as if the space itself was anticipating the revelation to come. As the guest approached the center of the room, the key began to hum, a faint vibration that resonated through the air. The light that had once shimmered around them now flared, bathing the room in an ethereal glow. And then, with a sudden shift, the key turned in their hand. The sound of the turning key was like a thunderclap, shattering the silence in an instant. The walls of the room seemed to collapse in on themselves, leaving only darkness. The guests stood, suspended in the void, no longer able to perceive the world around them. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn away, leaving only the raw, exposed truth of their own existence. In that moment, they realized what they had done. The door had been opened, and the truth they had long sought was now before them. But there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of triumph. Only the cold, disorienting feeling that came from looking too deeply into the abyss, from confronting a reality that was more complex, more horrifying than they had ever imagined. And as the darkness enveloped them, the guest understood, perhaps too late, that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The world, or what remained of it, hung suspended in a place between worlds. An oppressive stillness settled into the air. The darkness that had enveloped the guest's vision now began to shift, slowly, imperceptibly at first, but steadily growing more defined. Shapes emerged from the void, like memories, flickering with half-formed clarity. The room, though no longer present, seemed to be reforming around them, or perhaps they were reforming within it. It was not a place of tangible walls or familiar dimensions, but a construct of thought, memory, and unresolved tension. Each movement of the guest's body seemed to cause a ripple in the surrounding nothingness. The floor beneath their feet felt soft, as if the ground was not truly there, but a phantom layer suspended in the air. And yet there was a weight, a distinct, undeniable weight, bearing down on their chest, one that made it difficult to breathe. The truth they had sought was now within their grasp. But at what cost? In this suspended reality, the boundaries of time seemed irrelevant. They were no longer concerned with the ticking of a clock or the shifting of day into night. Every second stretched, bending with the intensity of what they had uncovered. The tall man's warning echoed in their mind like an endless loop. Truth is not a gift, it is a price. But how could the truth they sought be so costly? Why did it feel as though their very existence was now marked by some unseen debt? The guests' hands trembled as they pressed them against their chest, the sensation of pressure growing more unbearable. It wasn't physical, but it was far more profound, reaching into their soul. They could feel the weight of the knowledge, the recognition that what they had unlocked was not just an isolated incident or a forgotten secret, but something far deeper, more intrinsic to who they were. The truth was not just about what had been hidden from them. It was about what they had hidden from themselves. As the shapes in the darkness began to solidify, they saw flashes of their past, fragments that were not entirely their own. Faces they did not recognize but felt inexplicably connected to. Events that had never occurred in their conscious mind but felt familiar nonetheless. The more they looked, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. This place, the darkness, was not a void but a mirror, a reflection of everything they had ever ignored, suppressed, or forgotten. A distant voice, faint and almost imperceptible, began to speak. It was neither male nor female, young nor old, but something in between, a voice that resonated through the very fabric of the guest's being. "You asked for the truth," it said, the words reverberating, making the air itself vibrate with their intensity. "But you have not yet faced the fullness of it. The truth does not end where you thought it did." The guest recoiled instinctively, their minds scrambling for a way to escape, to return to the comfort of the life they had left behind. But the voice was insistent, pulling them deeper into the recesses of their own mind, into the recesses of something far darker than they had ever imagined. The truth was not just an external force, it was part of them. It had always been part of them. The voice continued, this time clearer, sharper, as if it had taken on a more corporeal form. "You are not the person you think you are. The life you believed you led, the choices you thought you made, they are but shadows of what truly exists." The guest felt their sense of self begin to erode, as though their very identity was being peeled away layer by layer. They had come here searching for answers, but now they were unsure what those answers would mean. Would they still recognize themselves once the truth had been fully revealed? Were they prepared to face the enormity of their own existence? Every fiber of their being screamed for release, to flee from this nightmare of revelations, but there was no escape. The air grew colder, more oppressive, and the shadows that had once been distant began to coalesce into more tangible forms. A figure, cloaked in darkness, stepped forward from the fog of the void. The guest recognized the figure immediately. It was the tall man, but not as he had been. Now, his form was twisted, as if pulled from the very fabric of the darkness itself. His eyes no longer gleamed with the cold, detached knowledge of someone merely guiding the guest along a path. They burned with an intensity that seemed to emanate from the core of the universe, an unsettling, all-consuming gaze that reached into the very heart of the guest. "You wanted the truth," the tall man said again, his voice now taking on a hollow resonance, as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "And now you will see it for what it truly is." The guest wanted to scream, but no sound escaped their lips. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, too heavy for words. They had reached the precipice of a revelation that would change everything, but it was no longer clear what that change would be. In their desperation for clarity, they had opened a door that could never be closed again. As the tall man extended his hand toward them, the guest instinctively stepped back, feeling the darkness draw closer, tightening around them. The truth, they realized, was not a singular moment of clarity. It was a continuous unraveling, a series of threads that would never again weave together into something whole. With a sudden shock, the guest was pulled forward, as if caught in a current stronger than anything they could resist. Their vision blurred, the shadows twisting around them like a living thing, and they knew, deep in their bones, that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The darkness was no longer just a space around them. It had become part of them. The truth was not something they could observe from a distance. It was something they were now bound to forever. And as the darkness consumed them entirely, they realized the terrible cost of their curiosity. The truth was not just a revelation. It was a prison, and they were the prisoner. The transition from the oppressive darkness to the clarity of reality was not a gentle one. There was no warm return to the comfort of familiarity, no safe landing. The guest's mind, now heavy with the weight of the truth, throbbed with an overwhelming clarity that was as suffocating as it was profound. The lines between the world they had once known and the place they had been thrust into were now blurred. In the instant that the darkness had consumed them, it had also altered their perception of reality in ways they could neither understand nor escape. The very air around them felt different now, as though it had been steeped in secrets. The sounds that once seemed ordinary, a creak of a door, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant chatter of guests, now held a sinister weight. Every movement felt amplified, as if they were keenly aware of every minute fluctuation in the atmosphere. The quiet hum of the party downstairs had faded into an unsettling silence. Their footsteps echoed too loudly as they moved, almost as if they were being watched, scrutinized from every corner. The guest tried to shake the sensation, but it clung to them like a shadow that refused to leave. Their senses, once dull and disinterested, were now hyper-aware. Every breath they took felt too sharp, too deliberate, as though their own lungs were betraying them. The walls of the house, once a symbol of comfort and refuge, now felt like a cage. They had crossed a threshold, and though their body was present in the house, their mind was somewhere far beyond it. The tall man's words echoed in their mind. "You are not the person you think you are." What had that truly meant? At first, they had believed it to be a cryptic warning, a riddle meant to unsettle. But now, with the weight of the truth pressing down on them, they began to wonder if there had ever been any real distinction between who they thought they were and who they truly were. Had the entire life they had lived been an illusion? Was everything that had come before nothing more than a charade? Every thought they had once held about their identity, their place in the world, now felt fragile, easily shattered. It was as if their memories were made of glass, so transparent, yet so easily broken. They recalled their upbringing, the people they had loved, the events that had shaped their life. Yet none of it seemed to hold the same meaning. Each memory, each moment, now carried with it the sting of doubt, the bitter taste of something missing. Was the life they had lived just an elaborate fabrication, or had they been blind to the truths lurking beneath the surface? The truth was no longer something they could observe from the outside. It was embedded within them, woven into their very being. But what had that truth truly revealed? That the boundaries between self and other were porous. That the reality they had known was merely a mask? The more they dwelled on it, the more they realized that the darkness they had been pulled into was not something external. It was a reflection of their inner turmoil, a manifestation of everything they had been unwilling to confront. Every corner of the house now felt like a reflection of the dissonance within them. The once familiar rooms were now filled with shadows, with unseen eyes that followed their every movement. The laughter that had once filled the house now seemed to be a mocking echo, a cruel reminder that they were no longer a part of that world. It felt as if the house itself had changed, becoming a foreign entity that no longer recognized them. It was then that they noticed something strange, a figure, faint and barely perceptible, standing just outside the doorway to the room. It was the shape of a person, but their features were indistinguishable, their body distorted as though caught in a moment of transition between forms. For a moment, the guest thought it was just their mind, playing tricks, a lingering effect of the darkness that had enveloped them. But the figure remained, unmoving, as if waiting for something. The guests' heart quickened. They knew they had to confront this figure, whatever it was. The party downstairs, the guests, the celebration, all of it had become irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was this figure and what it represented. Every step they took toward it felt deliberate, as if they were moving through thick, suffocating air. As they neared the doorway, the figure slowly began to take form, its shape becoming clearer with each passing second. What emerged from the shadows was not a person, not entirely. It was something far more unsettling, a reflection of the guests themselves, but twisted. Its eyes, once void of any emotion, now burned with an intensity that matched their own. The guest recoiled, taken aback by the sight of it. This distorted version of themselves that seemed to mock their every thought, every doubt. It was as if the figure knew them better than they knew themselves, had seen into the very depths of their soul. The guest's voice faltered as they tried to speak, but the figure responded before they could. "You sought the truth," it said, its voice a distorted echo of their own. "But truth comes with a price. You are the price." The weight of the words landed heavily upon the guest. This was no longer just a matter of understanding the past or unearthing hidden secrets. This was about facing the cost of the knowledge they had gained. The truth they had sought was not just an external force, but a part of them, one that would forever alter the course of their life. With this revelation came the crushing realization that they could never return to the life they had known. They had crossed an irreversible threshold. The truth had set them free, but it had also bound them to something far darker, something from which they could never escape. The house, the party, the people, none of it mattered anymore. The guest was no longer part of the world they had once inhabited. They were now forever bound to the truth, trapped in the prison of their own knowing. As the figure dissolved back into the shadows, the guest felt a deep, unsettling calm wash over them. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? The weight of the knowledge now felt less like a burden and more like an inescapable reality. They had sought to uncover the secrets of their past, but they had found something far worse: the realization that the past, the present, and the future were all inextricably bound together in a cycle of eternal uncertainty. In the silence that followed, the guest understood that they were no longer just a participant in their own story. They had become the story itself. And the truth was not just a destination. It was a journey, one that would never end. The air around the guest seemed to thicken with an oppressive force as the truth, though unveiled, lingered like a phantom in the shadows. Though they stood there, physically present in the house, it felt as if their very existence had been irreparably altered. They were not just a visitor in this space, but a foreign entity who had overstayed its welcome. The walls themselves seemed to close in, bearing witness to something far greater than a birthday party. They had stepped into something deeper, something unspoken. This sense of alienation was not one easily shaken off. Every sound felt louder now, from the faint hum of the refrigerator to the sound of distant voices from downstairs. The laughter, once an invitation to join in the revelry, now rang with a hollow resonance. It was no longer a celebration of life, but a muted reminder of everything the guest had lost. They were acutely aware of the people downstairs, those who still believed in the illusion of the party, but they themselves were beyond that veil. The faces of the party guests, though still vibrant with life, felt distant. They were no longer companions. They were characters, distant players in a story that no longer held meaning. The guests could see their movements, their smiles, but there was a coldness to it all. It was as though they had become mere spectators of a life they could no longer participate in. They had become haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the ghosts of their own mind. The faces of people they once knew now seemed like forgotten echoes. They tried to recall the faces of those closest to them, people they had once shared moments of joy and sorrow with. Yet as they did, those faces blurred. The names that should have come easily seemed to slip from their grasp. Were these people still a part of their life? Or had they been erased by the overwhelming truths they had uncovered? The guest realized with a shock that they no longer felt certain of who these people were. They had been present in their life, but were they still relevant? Had they too been part of the illusion, existing only in a world of half-truths? Memories that had once been vivid now seemed strained, distorted. They recalled a moment from their childhood, a warm summer evening filled with laughter, but now it felt distant, as if they were observing it from a great distance. The details, the warmth of the sunlight, the scent of the air, were all gone. The guests could only grasp at fragments, disjointed pieces that no longer made sense. It was as if the act of remembering had become an exhausting task, a futile attempt to reconnect with something that had already slipped away. The concept of time, once so rigid and structured, now felt like a fading illusion. They looked at the clock on the wall, its hands ticking steadily forward, but the passage of time seemed irrelevant. Was it even the same time as before? Had hours passed? Or was it only a few minutes? The birthday party downstairs, once the focal point of the evening, now seemed like an ancient ritual, something that no longer belonged in the present. The guests stood suspended between the past and the present, lost in a maze of forgotten moments and unfulfilled desires. There was an unsettling truth in their mind now. The past was not something they could ever reclaim. The people they had known, the experiences that had shaped them, were not part of the reality they now inhabited. They were like forgotten pages in a book, pages that had been torn out and scattered to the wind. And yet, the guests clung to the idea that perhaps there was something in those pages worth retrieving. The more they struggled to remember, the more they realized that the act of remembering itself had become a burden. It was not a bridge to the past, but a wall, a barrier that kept them from moving forward. In the silence of the room, the guests could feel the weight of their own existence pressing down on them. They had spent so much time searching for answers, seeking the truth, but now that they had it, they wondered if the truth had been worth the cost. What was the point of uncovering the past if the past no longer held any meaning? What use were the answers they had so desperately sought if they only served to alienate them from the present? The guests began to wonder if the pursuit of truth had been their downfall. A soft knock at the door interrupted their spiraling thoughts. It was a sound that seemed to come from a different world, one that had not been touched by the unsettling revelations they had encountered. They turned almost instinctively and found the door ajar. On the other side stood the tall man, the same figure who had led them to this place, the one who had revealed the truth of their existence. His face was unreadable, his expression a mixture of concern and something darker, more knowing. "You're here," the tall man said, his voice not quite a question, but more an acknowledgement. "You've seen it, haven't you? The burden of the forgotten." The guest nodded, unable to form words. How could they explain what they had just experienced? How could they articulate the gnawing emptiness that now consumed them? The tall man stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. His gaze did not waver. It was as if he could see straight through the guest, as if he knew exactly what they were feeling. "You can't escape it," the tall man continued, his voice now softer, more reflective. "The burden of knowing is that it forces you to confront what you've left behind. The people, the memories, they all fade into nothingness, lost to the passage of time. But that doesn't mean they were ever unimportant. It just means that you can no longer hold on to them. Not in the way you once did." The guests swallowed hard, their throat dry. The weight of the man's words settled in, heavier than they had ever expected. There was a truth in them, a truth that spoke of inevitability. Perhaps they had spent too long trying to hold on to the past, to the people who had once filled their life. But now, they realized they could no longer be the person they once were. The past had faded, and with it, so had the connections that once gave their life meaning. The tall man's words echoed in their mind, the burden of the forgotten. And yet, in that moment, the guest understood something crucial. They were not alone in this burden. It was the universal condition of all who sought truth. They could not expect to move forward without letting go of the past. The journey of knowing was not one of triumph, but of loss. The loss of who they had been, of who they might have become. But in that loss, there was also the possibility of transformation. To move forward, they would have to leave behind the ghosts of what had been. Only then could they begin the next chapter of their life. As the tall man left the room, The guests stood alone in the silence, confronting the enormity of what they had learned. The burden was theirs now, but so was the possibility of redemption. They had been forced to confront the darkness within, but it was not the end. It was only the beginning. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the guest understood that they were no longer bound by the past. They had freed themselves from its grasp, but in doing so, they had become something new, someone different. And that difference, however unsettling, held the key to their future. The guests stood at the window, their reflection distorting in the glass. The weight of the past, the revelations, and the encounter with the tall man felt as though it had cracked something deep within them. The illusion of normality, of a life that once made sense, had shattered beyond repair. What they had once believed to be real, friends, family, memories, now seemed like a fragile tapestry unraveling in the harsh light of truth. The sense of disillusionment was overwhelming, a slow, creeping tide that threatened to drown them. They had entered the party with the expectation of joy, of celebrating another year of life. But now, every corner of the house seemed to whisper a different story. The decorations, once vibrant and filled with meaning, now felt hollow, like cheap masks hiding something far more sinister beneath. The cake, still sitting untouched on the table, was no longer a symbol of festivity, but an absurd reminder of the absurdity of it all. What was there to celebrate when everything they knew was slipping away? The people downstairs, who had once seemed so familiar, now felt like strangers. It wasn't just the absence of connection that disturbed them. It was the overwhelming feeling that these people had never been part of their life to begin with. How had they managed to weave themselves into the fabric of their existence without truly belonging? The guest's mind raced, but every answer was elusive, a moving target that seemed impossible to pin down. The more they tried to make sense of it all, the more their perception of reality felt distorted. The past was no longer a solid foundation on which to build the future. It had become a shifting, unstable landscape, one where every step was fraught with uncertainty. They thought about their life before the party, before the truth had come crashing down on them. Were those years really theirs to claim? Had they ever been their own? Or had they been a construct, a narrative carefully crafted to disguise the emptiness they had failed to recognize? Every memory, once cherished, was now a question mark suspended in the air like a dark cloud. In a desperate attempt to regain some sense of control, the guests retraced their steps, replaying moments from the party. They tried to anchor themselves in the tangible, the moments they could remember clearly. But even those were becoming distorted. A conversation with a close friend seemed to fade before their eyes. The laughter that had once been contagious now sounded mechanical, lacking the warmth they had once associated with it. Faces blurred into anonymity. Nothing felt authentic anymore. The more they examined the situation, the more they realized that the lies they had once lived by were no longer just illusions. They were a form of imprisonment. The guests had been bound by these fabrications for so long that they hadn't even recognized their own captivity. The truth, when it finally arrived, had not been liberating as they had once hoped. It had exposed the chains, the lies, the manipulations that had held them in place for so long. And now, they were left to confront the wreckage. Their mind drifted to the tall man's words. The burden of the forgotten, he had said. But the guest realized now that the burden was not just about the memories that had slipped away. It was about the very concept of forgetting, of how easy it was to let go of the things that once defined them. The illusion of permanence had been the greatest lie of all. They had been so focused on preserving their past, clinging to a version of themselves that no longer existed, that they had failed to see how deeply they were buried in their own delusions. Forgetting was not just a process of erasing memories. It was a means of survival. The guests could not shake the feeling that they had been complicit in their own deception. They had chosen to believe in the stability of the world around them, despite the growing whispers of doubt. Now that the truth had broken through the surface, they were left to wonder if they had ever truly understood what was real. The people they had surrounded themselves with, the choices they had made, the very life they had constructed, had it all been a grand performance? And if so, who was the audience? The thought of confronting the others downstairs, of returning to the party, seemed almost impossible. How could they face these people when they no longer recognized the foundation of their relationship with them? They were no longer the same person who had walked into this house earlier that evening. The guest felt as though they had been stripped of their identity, exposed to the raw, uncomfortable truth of their existence. The weight of that vulnerability pressed down on them like a stone. But as they stood there, paralyzed by their own confusion, something inside them stirred. A flicker of defiance, a small spark that had been buried beneath the layers of doubt, began to burn. The guest realized that while they might not be able to undo the past, they still had the power to shape the future. The illusion of stability had crumbled, but that did not mean they were powerless. In fact, this new reality, however painful, offered a strange kind of freedom. The guest finally moved away from the window, their reflection now a mere shadow against the glass. The truth, as harsh and painful as it was, had revealed something important. They were not defined by their past, by their mistakes, or the lies they had once believed. They were something more, something undefined, something that could no longer be held back by the false narratives they had clung to. They had the ability to recreate themselves, to redefine their existence. It would not be easy. It would not be without loss. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the guests could see a path forward, beyond the shattered illusions and the crumbling memories. They took a deep breath, steadied themselves, and walked back into the house. The party downstairs was still ongoing, but now it felt less like a celebration and more like a symbol of everything they had left behind. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, they didn't feel the need to have all the answers. They were ready to face the unknown, to confront the disorienting reality that lay before them, and to step beyond the boundaries of their former life. Whatever came next, they were no longer the same person who had walked into this house hours before. And that in itself was something worth celebrating. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each passing moment. The guest, after taking a few tentative steps back into the realm of the party, realized that the world they had once known had transformed into something both foreign and hauntingly familiar. They could still hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the murmurs of conversation echoing through the hallways. But it was as if these sounds were no longer tied to the people who had produced them. The sounds felt detached, like a broken record stuck in an endless loop. The guest felt out of place, as if they were watching from the outside, a spectator in a life they could no longer recognize. At first, they tried to blend in, to carry on as if everything was normal. After all, what else could they do? But every time they tried to speak to someone, the words seemed hollow. The faces around them were familiar, yet distant. They no longer carried the warmth they once did. It was as if a wall had been built between them and the others, a wall made of forgotten truths and unspoken realizations. Conversations turned into static, background noise that failed to penetrate the overwhelming sense of alienation. What had once been a simple gathering of friends and family now felt like a gathering of strangers. The guest watched as their acquaintances interacted with ease, smiling, joking, and enjoying the evening. And yet, the guest felt no connection to them, no sense of belonging. These people, who had once been their closest companions, now seemed like actors in a play, performing roles they had long since forgotten. They wondered, in a moment of disquiet, whether they too were simply playing a part, a role they had been cast in without even realizing it. The guest's mind raced back to the conversation with the tall man. He had spoken of forgotten things, of lives lived and lost, of memories that were no longer their own. Was that what was happening to them now? Had they, too, become a forgotten piece of some larger narrative, a fleeting character in a story that no longer cared for their existence? The question lingered in their mind, unanswered, yet it gnawed at them. The tall man's words seemed more profound with each passing moment, as if they had unlocked a door to a truth the guest wasn't ready to face. As the hours wore on, the weight of isolation began to press down on the guest. They found themselves retreating to the periphery of the room, watching from a distance as people danced, laughed, and celebrated. The whole scene felt like a dream, an illusion that they were no longer a part of. Every now and then, someone would glance in their direction, but the guests could see the brief flicker of confusion in their eyes before they turned away. It was as if the guests no longer existed in the same way, as if they were fading into the background, becoming invisible with each passing second. The realization came in a flash. They were not merely detached from the present moment. They were detached from the past. The lives they had lived, the people they had known, the events that had shaped them. None of it seemed to matter anymore. It was as if all these things had never happened. The guests tried to recall the details of their past, the moments that had once seemed so vivid, but they were slipping away, disintegrating like dust in the wind. Names, faces, events, they all blurred together in an indistinct haze. For the first time, the guest felt the terrifying weight of amnesia, not just of memory, but of identity. Who were they, if not the sum of their experiences? If all their memories could be wiped away, if the people they had known could no longer recognize them, what was left? Were they still the same person, or had they become someone else entirely? The thought was both liberating and terrifying. To be free of the past meant that they could reinvent themselves, but it also meant that they were unmoored, floating in a sea of nothingness with no anchor to hold them steady. Their gaze drifted to the partygoers once more. The laughter still filled the air, but now it seemed grotesque, like a mask hiding the truth of their isolation. There was a sense of danger in the air, a sense that something more sinister was lurking beneath the surface. But the guests could not place what it was. It was not a physical threat, but something far deeper, a quiet, creeping unease that seemed to seep into their bones. The night was no longer about celebration. It was about survival. Surviving the disintegration of their own sense of self. Surviving the alienation that had taken root in their heart. In a moment of clarity, the guest recognized the true nature of their predicament. They were not just facing the loss of their memories or the dissolution of their relationships. They were facing the loss of their very essence, the thing that had once made them who they were. The party, the people, the decorations, these were just distractions from the deep, existential crisis that was unfolding within them. This was not a battle against the forces of the world outside. This was a battle against the forces within. And yet, despite the despair that clung to them like a shadow, the guests could not bring themselves to leave. They could not turn away from the party, from the people, from the life they had once known. There was still a faint hope, however small, that if they stayed long enough, something would click, something would make sense. Maybe the truth was closer than they thought. Maybe there was a way out of this strange, disorienting labyrinth they had found themselves in. But until then, they could only wait and watch as the people around them danced, oblivious to the storm raging inside. The guests stood there, frozen in place, unsure whether to confront the growing sense of disorientation or retreat into the safety of the unknown. The world around them was changing, shifting beneath their feet, and they were left to wonder, would they ever find their way back, or was this the beginning of a new, unsettling chapter in their life? They didn't know the answer, but they knew one thing for certain. The past they had once known was gone, and the future was now a vast, uncertain horizon. In the midst of the ever-diminishing sense of reality, the guests continued to linger in the house. Every movement, every sound, and every interaction felt increasingly distorted, as if they were no longer grounded in the same world as the others. The party, once a symbol of joy and togetherness, had now become a symbol of suffocating disconnection. The laughter echoed off the walls like a hollow reminder of a life that no longer existed. The guest felt detached from the present moment, trapped in a liminal space between the past and the future, neither fully present nor fully absent. As they observed the party-goers, something unsettling began to stir within them. The faces around them seemed frozen in time, locked in expressions that no longer conveyed the true emotions of the individuals. People danced and talked, their movements mechanical, almost rehearsed. The guests couldn't help but wonder if they too were moving in the same way. If their own actions were now driven by an unseen hand, controlled by forces they didn't understand. Were they still themselves? Or had they too become part of the eerie performance unfolding around them? A quiet realization began to settle in the guest's mind. The party was not just an event. It was a prison. The walls of the house, once familiar and comforting, now felt oppressive, as if they were closing in on the guest with every passing moment. There was no escape from the discomfort, no refuge from the growing sense of entrapment. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, it was all a facade, a mask hiding something far darker. The people were not truly here. They were mere phantoms, puppets dancing to a tune that the guest could no longer hear. The more the guest thought about it, the clearer it became. The party, the house, the people, they were all fragments of a broken reality. None of it was real. The warmth of friendship, the lightness of shared moments, they had all been stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard truth. The guest was alone in this warped version of the world, surrounded by echoes of a life that no longer existed. They had been pulled into this strange and unending cycle, forced to play a role in a world that had lost all meaning. In an attempt to regain control, the guest tried to leave. They moved toward the door, their steps hurried, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the house. But as they reached for the handle, a sudden chill ran down their spine. The door refused to budge. It was locked, but not in the way a door should be. It was as though the door itself was rejecting them, as if it too was part of the illusion. Panic set in as the guest realized there was no way out. Not physically, and certainly not emotionally. The house, the party, the people, everything had become a trap, a never-ending loop with no escape. Turning away from the door, the guest moved back into the center of the room, their mind racing. They felt as if they were suffocating, their chest tight with the weight of the realization that had been slowly building inside them. They were caught in a web of their own making, a trap set by their own mind, and the more they struggled, the tighter the strands seemed to pull. No matter how hard they tried to fight against it, the truth was inescapable. They were the ones who had brought themselves here. They had chosen this path, knowingly or unknowingly, and now they were forced to confront the consequences. The tall man's words echoed again in their mind. "You've come here before?" The guest shuddered, the meaning of those words finally sinking in. This was not the first time they had experienced this. In fact, it wasn't even the second. The guest had been trapped in this cycle countless times before, repeating the same actions, the same decisions, over and over again, without even realizing it. Each birthday, each party, each moment, it was all part of a pattern, a loop they couldn't escape. The house was not just a physical space. It was a manifestation of their own mind, a prison built from their own fears and regrets. The realization hit like a tidal wave. The guest wasn't just a passive observer in this nightmare. They were the architect of their own suffering. The party, the guests, the laughter, it was all a reflection of their own inner turmoil, a manifestation of the parts of themselves they could not face. The tall man had been right. They had come here before, and they would come here again, as long as they refused to confront the darkness inside them. In that moment, the guest understood that there was no way out, at least not until they could face the truth. The party would continue, the people would dance, and the house would remain, but they would never find peace as long as they remained blind to the truth of their existence. The only way to escape was to break the cycle, to let go of the past and embrace the present, no matter how terrifying it might be. But how could they do that when they no longer knew who they were? The guest looked around at the faces of the people who had once been their friends. They no longer recognized them. But it wasn't just the faces that were unfamiliar. It was the entire world. The party was no longer a celebration of life. It was a celebration of denial, of the refusal to confront what lay beneath the surface. The laughter, the music, the warmth of the room, they were all distractions, a way to avoid the painful truth that the guest could no longer ignore. And so, as the night stretched on and the people continued to dance around them, the guest was left with a haunting question that would linger in their mind. How long would they continue to run from themselves? The answer, they feared, was one they would never escape from. At least, not until they could finally accept that the most terrifying part of this nightmare wasn't the house or the people, but the reflections staring back at them from within. The oppressive weight of the house continued to press down on the guest, suffocating them with each passing moment. The realization that the party was not just a gathering, but a prison of their own making, haunted them like a ghost in the corner of their mind. The laughter around them had become increasingly hollow, and the faces of the partygoers, once familiar and comforting, had transformed into masks of emptiness. Everything about this night felt wrong, like a bad dream they could never wake from. And yet they couldn't escape it. They were trapped, locked within this cycle that seemed to have no beginning or end. But as the guests looked around the room, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a fleeting moment where the madness of the night seemed to pause, just for a second. They looked at the faces of the people around them, people they had once known, once loved, once trusted, and saw something unexpected. There was fear in their eyes, yes, but also something else, recognition. As if deep within themselves, these people knew the truth. They too were trapped in the same cycle. They too were caught in the web of repetition. And for the first time, the guest realized that they weren't alone in this nightmare. The tall man had been right, the guest understood now. They had come here before, but so had the others. This party, this house, it wasn't just about them. It was a reflection of everyone who had ever been trapped in their own mind, unable to break free from the patterns and behaviors that kept them locked in place. The people here weren't just faceless figures. They were the embodiment of every mistake, every regret, and every fear that the guest had ever faced. And just like the guest, they were desperate for an escape they didn't know how to find. With that realization, something in the guest's mind clicked. It was as if a door, long closed, had finally creaked open, revealing a path they had never noticed before. The cycle wasn't just something they had to break for themselves. It was something they had to break for everyone. The house, the party, the guests, they were all part of the same twisted reflection. And the only way out was to confront it, to shatter the illusion that had been built around them. The guests felt a surge of determination. They weren't going to let themselves be trapped any longer. They weren't going to let the past continue to define them. The first step was simple. They had to acknowledge the truth. They had to admit that they had been running from their own fears, their own failures, and their own self-doubt. They had been so afraid of facing what was inside them that they had allowed themselves to get lost in the facade of the party, the distraction of the house, the illusion of the people around them. But now, they were ready to face it all. The guests took a deep breath, their chest heavy with the weight of the decision they had just made. They turned to the people around them, the guests whose faces had begun to blur together in a strange, unsettling way. It was time to confront them, to break the silence that had held them all captive. The guests stepped forward, their voice trembling as they spoke. "We're all trapped," they said, the words ringing out into the stillness of the room. "We've all been stuck in this cycle, this endless loop, but we don't have to stay here. We can break free. We can stop running from ourselves." The room fell silent. The guests stared at the guest, as if they had never heard such words before. For a moment, the guest wondered if they had said the wrong thing. But then, slowly, something strange began to happen. The masks began to slip. The eyes that had once been filled with emptiness started to fill with something else. Something like recognition, like understanding. The faces, once so alien, now seemed more familiar, more human. And then, one by one, the partygoers began to speak. Their voices, once muffled by fear and confusion, broke free. Each person shared a truth they had been hiding, a fear they had been running from. There were tears, yes, but there was also something else, hope. The guest realized in that moment that they had not been alone. They had never been alone. They had simply been unable to see the others, trapped in their own version of the same nightmare. But now, the illusion was breaking. The walls were coming down. And for the first time, the guests saw the party for what it truly was. Not a celebration of life, but a reflection of everything they had feared, everything they had avoided. But even as the walls crumbled, there was a nagging thought in the guest's mind. Was this truly the end? Or was this just another layer of the cycle? Another illusion they had yet to peel back? It was hard to tell. The house still felt heavy, still pressed down on them, still held them in its grip. The party still buzzed with that eerie energy that sensed that something was just not right. The guests knew they couldn't trust the way things seemed. The world was shifting, and they had to stay alert. But they also knew something had changed. For the first time, they felt a flicker of hope. It was small, barely a spark, but it was there. They had broken through something that had been holding them back, something that had kept them trapped in the cycle for so long. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt possible. They didn't know what would happen next, but they knew they had to keep moving forward, keep confronting the truths they had avoided for so long. As the party continued around them, the guests took one last look at the people they had once known, the faces that had been so distorted, so unfamiliar. And for the first time, they saw them clearly, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as fellow travelers on a path that was only just beginning. They had all been trapped together, but now they had the chance to break free. The only question was, would they have the courage to do it? The guests didn't have all the answers. They didn't know how this cycle would end, or if it would even end at all. But they knew one thing for certain: they were no longer alone. And that, perhaps, was enough to keep going. The moment had come, the culmination of everything. The illusions, the cycles, the party, and the house was now laid bare in front of the guest. After everything they had witnessed, endured, and fought against, the end was nothing like they had expected. It wasn't a grand confrontation or a dramatic revelation. It was quiet, almost mundane, yet it carried the weight of everything they had struggled to understand. In this moment, the guest understood that breaking the cycle wasn't about defeating some external force, but rather about accepting the internal truths they had long denied. The party had come to an unnatural stillness. No longer was there music or laughter filling the air. The conversations had faded, and the buzz of excitement had died down into a heavy silence. Everyone was waiting, although no one knew for what. Even the walls of the house, which had once seemed to pulse with a life of their own, now stood still, as if they, too, had exhausted their energy. The house no longer felt like a prison. It simply felt like a house, a place where things happened, where people existed, but no longer a place that could define them. The guests looked around, feeling the weight of those silent eyes upon them. They could see the others, the party-goers, all now aware of what had been hidden in plain sight. The cycle, the loop, the repetitive nature of their existence here. But there was something different in their eyes now. The fear that had once been so pronounced was gone, replaced by something deeper, something like understanding or maybe resignation. The guest had no illusions that they were the only one who had come to terms with the truth. They had all seen it now. They were all awake. And yet, it wasn't enough. The guest knew that this was only the beginning of the true challenge. Breaking the cycle wasn't about acknowledgement alone. It was about the decision to leave. To truly break free, they needed to step away, to step out of the house entirely, leaving behind everything that had once felt familiar, everything that had once felt like home. For so long, they had been tethered to this place, even when they didn't fully understand why. It wasn't just the house. It was the comfort of knowing what to expect, the safety of staying within the boundaries of a familiar nightmare. But the guest realized now that they couldn't remain in this space any longer. They couldn't remain in the past. The challenge was in the leaving. The house might have been a prison, but it had also been their crutch. And as the guest took a slow step toward the door, the final step that would take them beyond this twisted reality, they were overwhelmed with the weight of what they were about to do. To leave meant to face the unknown. To leave meant to face the possibility of starting over from scratch, of facing the world as it truly was, without the layers of protection they had built for themselves. It meant accepting the fact that they couldn't control everything, that the future was uncertain, and that there would be pain, doubt, and fear. But the guest understood now that they didn't need to control everything. They didn't need to have all the answers. What they needed was to walk through the door, to take the step into the world beyond the house. The unknown was no longer something to be feared. It was a necessary part of the journey. The guests could not move forward without leaving behind the things that had held them captive. They could not grow if they remained tethered to a past that no longer served them. The door, which had once seemed so distant, was now within reach. With each step they took, the weight of the past lifted slightly. They could feel the air growing lighter, the world outside beckoning with the promise of something different, something real. The other guests watched, still silent, still waiting. They were all at a crossroads now, all standing on the threshold of the unknown. Some would take the step with them, others would remain behind. But the guests knew that they had no choice. They had to leave, and as they reached for the door, something unexpected happened. The house, which had been so oppressive, seemed to shift. The walls seemed to bend, the air thickening once again as if resisting their departure. For a moment, the guest wondered if the cycle would start again, if they would be pulled back into the web of repetition they had so desperately tried to escape. But they pushed forward, resolute. They would not be dragged back. The decision was theirs, and no force in the world could take that away from them. With a final push, they stepped through the door and into the night. It was cold outside, the air crisp with the bite of winter. The world felt vast and empty, yet strangely alive. It wasn't a perfect world, nor a world free of pain, but it was real. The sky above them was dark, the stars sharp against the deep canvas of the heavens. The guest took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had left behind, but also feeling the spark of something new. There was no guarantee of what lay ahead, but the future was theirs to face. As they looked back one last time, the house stood silent behind them, no longer a looming threat, but a distant memory. The party was over. The cycle had been broken, and the guest, though uncertain of what would come next, was free at last. There was no need for grand explanations, no need for closure. They had walked out, and that was enough. They had broken the cycle, and now, for the first time, they were free to truly live.